History has a way of smoothing out the rough edges, turning kings and queens into polished statues, distant, untouchable, almost mythical. But what if I told you that behind the gilded portraits and carefully crafted legacies, some of the most legendary rulers of all time hid secrets so shocking, so strange, they'd make even the boldest storyteller pause? Think about the names we all know: Henry VIII, Cleopatra, Louis XIV, figures frozen in time by their grandeur. Yet the truth is, their lives were bursting with contradictions, scandals, and quirks that never made it into your school textbooks. Take a step closer and you'll find crowns tarnished by hidden obsessions, thrones wobbling under bizarre superstitions, and royal chambers echoing with whispers of scandal. Did you know one queen kept a black cat as her chief advisor, or that a king once declared war on an inanimate object? These aren't just odd footnotes, they're glimpses into the humanity of rulers who shaped empires, loved recklessly, and sometimes lost their grip on reality. And that's exactly what we're uncovering today. 25 little-known facts about history's most iconic monarchs, stories so captivating, you'll wonder how they stayed buried for centuries. This isn't just a list, it's a journey into the shadows of power, where the line between genius and madness blurs. Picture the shock of discovering that a king you thought was ruthless had a secret passion for knitting, or that a fearsome warrior queen wrote heartbreaking poetry in her spare time. These details don't diminish their legacies, they make them electric, alive. So settle in, because by the time we're done, you'll never look at history's golden figures the same way again. The past is about to get a lot more interesting. Cleopatra wasn't just a queen who ruled with beauty and charm, her real power lay in her voice. While history often paints her as a seductress, the truth is far more fascinating. She spoke at least 9 languages fluently, a staggering feat for any ruler of her time. Imagine negotiating with Roman generals in their native Latin, charming foreign diplomats in Ethiopian or Hebrew, and even debating scholars in Greek, the language of her own elite education. But what truly set her apart was her mastery of Egyptian. She was the first and only Ptolemaic ruler to learn it, breaking a 300-year tradition of Greek-speaking monarchs who kept themselves distant from the people they ruled. This wasn't just about words, it was strategy. When Cleopatra addressed her subjects in their own tongue, it wasn't just a political stunt. She was sending a message: I am one of you. In a land where pharaohs were seen as divine, her ability to speak the language of the priests and the commoners alike cemented her legitimacy. And then there were the alliances. Fluent Arabic let her navigate treaties with desert tribes, while her command of Persian and Syriac opened doors in a fractured Middle East. Even her enemies couldn't ignore the advantage of a ruler who could eavesdrop on every whispered plot in her court without needing a translator. Behind this linguistic brilliance was an education few could match. Tutored by the finest scholars in Alexandria's legendary library, she devoured philosophy, astronomy, and medicine alongside her language studies. Some accounts even claim she authored books on weights and measures, though none survive today. But here's the twist: her multilingualism wasn't just about intellect. It was survival. In a world where kings and generals saw her as a pawn, words became her weapons. When Julius Caesar first met her, legend says she didn't need an interpreter. She spoke to him directly in flawless Greek. That moment didn't just spark a romance, it reshaped history, because Cleopatra knew something empires often forget: to rule minds, you must first speak to hearts. And she did, in every language her enemies understood. Henry VIII is remembered for his 6 wives and the ruthless dissolution of monasteries, but few realize he was also a gifted musician who found solace in composing. Long before he became the bloated, paranoid figure of his later years, the young Henry was a Renaissance man, athletic, scholarly, and deeply passionate about music. He played the lute, the harp, and the virginals with skill, but his true legacy lies in an original composition that survives to this day, Pastime with Good Company. This lively tune, sometimes called the King's Ballad, wasn't just a royal hobby, it was a window into his soul. The lyrics reveal a Henry we rarely see. Pastime with good company, I love and shall until I die. At a time when his reign was spiraling into tyranny, these words hint at a longing for joy, camaraderie, and the artistic pursuits of his youth. Court records show he kept a personal orchestra of nearly 60 musicians, and ambassadors wrote of his habit of interrupting state banquets to perform impromptu concerts. One account describes him grabbing a lute to play alongside visiting French nobles, dazzling them with his technique. Music wasn't just entertainment, it was diplomacy, a way to project power through culture rather than force. But there's a darker irony here. The same hands that plucked strings so delicately would later sign death warrants for friends and wives. Some scholars believe music became an escape from the weight of his decisions, a brief return to the golden prince he'd once been. His daughter Elizabeth would later revive his musical legacy, but for Henry, composition may have been less about legacy and more about fleeting moments of peace. In the end, Pastime with Good Company endures as a haunting counterpoint to his infamous reign, proof that even the most feared rulers had their fragile human harmonies. Catherine the Great's death became the stuff of legend, not because of how she died, but because of how her enemies wanted her to be remembered. The infamous rumor that she perished in a tryst with a horse is one of history's most outrageous smears, a lie so grotesque it overshadowed her actual achievements for centuries. But where did this myth come from? The answer lies in the machinations of her political rivals. Catherine, the German-born empress who modernized Russia, expanded its borders and championed the arts, was a thorn in the side of conservative nobles and foreign adversaries alike. When she suffered a fatal stroke in 1796, those who feared her legacy seized the moment to twist her death into something grotesque. The horse rumor didn't emerge from thin air, it was carefully crafted propaganda. French pamphlets eager to undermine Russia's growing power circulated exaggerated tales of her private life, painting her as a debauched monarch rather than the enlightened ruler she was. The absurdity of the claim that a woman in her 60s, known for her sharp intellect and disciplined routines, would meet such a bizarre end didn't matter. Shock value was the point. Even Voltaire, her longtime correspondent, mocked the story, writing that it was as likely as a horse composing an opera. Yet the lie persisted, fueled by misogyny and the discomfort some felt toward a woman who wielded absolute power without apology. The truth, uncovered in court physicians' records, was far more mundane, a cerebral hemorrhage that struck her in the privacy of her chambers. But the contrast between fact and fiction reveals something deeper: how easily a ruler's reputation could be hijacked by those threatened by her influence. Catherine's real legacy, her reforms in education, her correspondence with Enlightenment thinkers, even her shrewd diplomatic maneuvering, was buried under salacious gossip. Centuries later, the horse myth still lingers in pop culture, a testament to the enduring power of propaganda. And that's the tragedy. A queen who spent her life elevating Russia was reduced to a punchline by those who couldn't bear her greatness. Louis XIV didn't just rule France, he danced it into glory. Long before he became the Sun King, a title he earned not just for his radiance but for his literal portrayal of Apollo on stage, Louis was a performer who turned ballet into a political weapon. Between 1653 and 1670, he graced the stage in over 40 lavish productions, often in the starring role, wearing costumes so encrusted with jewels they'd stagger modern audiences. But this wasn't mere vanity, it was statecraft in motion. Every pirouette, every leap was a calculated display of power, a way to show his nobles that their king wasn't just a ruler but a celestial force. The ballet Le Ballet de la Nuit, performed in 1653, wasn't just entertainment, it was propaganda. For 12 hours spread across multiple nights, Louis danced as the sun god, emerging triumphant over darkness, a not-so-subtle metaphor for his absolute authority. The message was clear. Just as Apollo brought light to the world, Louis would bring order to France. His courtiers weren't just spectators, they were participants, forced to dance alongside him in roles that reinforced their submission. A misstep in choreography could mean a misstep in politics, and the king's grace onstage mirrored his grip on power. But Louis didn't stop at performances. In 1661, he codified his obsession by founding the Académie Royale de Danse, the first institution to formalize ballet as an art form. This wasn't just about preserving steps, it was about controlling culture. By standardizing technique, he ensured that ballet would forever bear the stamp of his reign. The 5 positions of the feet still taught today, they were refined under his watch. Even his own retirement from the stage at age 32 wasn't an end. He simply shifted from dancer to director, using ballet to shape the aesthetics of absolutism. Versailles' Hall of Mirrors didn't just reflect light. It reflected the spectacle of a king who turned movement into monarchy. And in doing so, Louis proved that sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin not on battlefields but on a dance floor. Elizabeth I didn't just wear the crown, she weaponized pirates to safeguard it. While history remembers her as the Virgin Queen, draped in pearls and power, few realize she secretly bankrolled some of the most notorious sea raiders of her time. Enter Francis Drake, a man the Spanish called El Drac, the Dragon, a pirate so feared his name alone could empty harbors. But to Elizabeth, he wasn't a criminal, he was a knight of the waves, armed with her silent blessing and a royal wink. This wasn't just about stolen gold, it was geopolitics in disguise. With Spain's armada looming and England's treasury stretched thin, Elizabeth turned to a shadow navy of privateers, granting them letters of marque, official licenses to pillage under the English flag. Drake's most infamous raid, the capture of the Spanish treasure ship Cacafugo in 1579, wasn't a rogue act of piracy. It was a calculated strike orchestrated with the Queen's covert backing. The haul, a staggering 26 tons of silver, enough to bankroll England's military for months. Elizabeth, ever the strategist, took her cut while publicly feigning ignorance, leaving Spain fuming but unable to declare outright war. The impact rippled far beyond plundered cargo. Drake's voyages mapped hostile coasts, gathered intelligence, and tested Spain's naval weaknesses, intel that proved priceless when the Spanish Armada finally attacked in 1588. The very pirates Spain despised became England's first line of defense, their knowledge of winds and currents turning the tide of battle. And then there's the darker truth: this partnership wasn't noble. While Drake delivered riches, other privateers blurred the line between privateering and outright brutality, attacking neutral ships and alienating allies. Elizabeth walked a razor's edge, condemning piracy in public while pocketing its profits in private. Yet without this unsavory alliance, England might never have become a naval superpower. The gold seized funded new ships, fortified ports, and emboldened explorers. Drake's circumnavigation of the globe, a feat that made him a hero at home, was in reality a glorified smuggling run, his ship the Golden Hind stuffed with Spanish loot. Elizabeth's genius lay in seeing what others dismissed, that sometimes a queen's strongest weapons aren't her armies, but the outlaw she shrewdly ties to her throne. And when the storm of war finally broke, it wasn't just her navy that saved England. It was the pirates she'd quietly unleashed upon the world. Nero didn't just want to rule Rome, he wanted to conquer the Olympics. In 67 AD, the emperor staged one of history's most brazen acts of athletic fraud, turning the ancient games into a personal vanity project. Chariot racing was the crown jewel of Greek competition, a test of skill and courage where drivers risked death at every turn. But Nero, with his insatiable hunger for glory, saw it differently, as a stage where the rules didn't apply to an emperor. His triumph in the 10-horse chariot race, an event so dangerous even seasoned athletes avoided it, was a farce from start to finish. Witnesses wrote that Nero, more accustomed to singing poetry than handling reins, was thrown from his chariot almost immediately. He didn't just crash, he failed to finish the race at all. Yet when the dust settled, the judges declared him the winner. Why? Because Nero had arrived in Greece with a fortune in gold, bribing officials and strong-arming competitors into withdrawing. The same man who allegedly fiddled while Rome burned now demanded laurels for failure, and the terrified judges obliged, but the cheating didn't stop there. Nero entered and won every event he fancied, from lyre playing to tragedy acting, events no Roman noble would typically join. The Greeks, who revered the Olympics as sacred, watched in stunned silence as their traditions became a punchline. Nero's victories weren't just dishonest, they were sacrilege. The emperor even postponed the games by a year to fit his travel schedule, something unheard of in centuries of tradition. This wasn't mere ego, it was a window into his crumbling grip on reality. By 67 AD, Nero's reign was unraveling. Plots against him multiplied, and his response was to flee to Greece, not as a statesman but as a desperate performer seeking validation. The Olympic scandal laid bare his delusion. If he couldn't control Rome's politics, he'd dominate its culture. But the irony, his cheating backfired. When Nero returned to Rome with over 1,800 victory wreaths, even his sycophants struggled to pretend this was anything but pathetic. Within a year, he'd be dead, forced to suicide by rebels. The Greeks, meanwhile, quietly erased his name from their records. Nero's Olympic fraud remains a cautionary tale. No amount of gold can buy glory when everyone knows it's a lie. Marie Antoinette never actually said, "Let them eat cake," but that didn't stop history from turning her into the ultimate symbol of royal callousness. The infamous phrase first appeared in philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Confessions, written when Antoinette was just 9 years old and still a carefree archduchess in Austria. Rousseau attributed the remark to an unnamed great princess, a vague reference likely inspired by earlier tales of tone-deaf nobility. So how did this fictional quip become permanently glued to a queen who probably never even heard it? The answer lies in the explosive power of revolutionary propaganda, where truth mattered far less than emotional impact. By the time bread shortages sparked riots in 1789, Antoinette had already been cast as the villain of France's economic woes. Her lavish spending on gowns, gardens, and gambling real enough made her an easy target for pamphleteers eager to stoke public fury. The mythical cake line was the perfect spark, crystallizing the rage of starving citizens into a single damning soundbite. Never mind that Antoinette had actually shown concern for the poor, founding orphanages and donating to charities. Revolutionary leaders like Camille Desmoulins weaponized her Austrian heritage, painting her as a foreign parasite feasting while France starved. The irony, the real Marie Antoinette was far more politically naive than deliberately cruel. Her famous affair of the diamond necklace scandal, where fraudsters used her name to swindle jewelers, revealed how little she understood public perception. Isolated in Versailles, she failed to grasp how her petticoats and porcelain dairy farm at the Hameau de la Réunion looked to a nation in crisis. But the revolutionaries didn't need nuance, they needed a monster. And so the myth stuck, outliving her by centuries, even her final act accidentally stepping on her executioner's foot and murmuring, "Pardon me, sir," couldn't erase the caricature. Today, historians agree the cake quote was fiction, but its legacy proved more enduring than the monarchy itself. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing a ruler can do isn't ignoring their people, it's letting others define the story. When Howard Carter cracked open Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, the world didn't just get a glimpse of ancient gold, it got a full-blown supernatural thriller. The sudden death of Lord Carnarvon, the expedition's financier, just months later sent shockwaves through high society. A mosquito bite on his cheek became infected, and as he lay dying in Cairo, newspapers reported a bizarre detail. At the exact moment of his passing, the lights in his hometown of London mysteriously flickered out. Add to that his dog reportedly howling and dropping dead the same night, and you've got all the ingredients for a curse tailor-made for the Roaring Twenties. But here's what the newspapers didn't highlight. Carnarvon was already in poor health, and most of the tomb's excavators lived well into old age. Howard Carter himself, the man who first peered into the burial chamber, died 16 years later of entirely natural causes. Even Carnarvon's daughter, present at the tomb's opening, survived another 57 years. So why did the curse stick? Blame the perfect storm of timing and tabloid hysteria. The 1920s were an era obsessed with spiritualism and the occult, with seances and Ouija boards as popular as jazz records. When Carnarvon's death made headlines, the media seized on every eerie coincidence, ignoring the dozens of workers and archaeologists who walked away unscathed. Enter Hollywood. By the 1930s, studios were churning out mummy horror films, turning Tut's curse into a box office goldmine. Boris Karloff's bandaged monster lumbering through foggy sets had little to do with reality, but it cemented the myth in pop culture. Even science played into the hype. Early theories about toxic mold or ancient booby traps only fed the mystery. But modern research suggests simpler explanations. Carnarvon's death was tragic, yes, but statistically unremarkable. The real curse, the way legends outlive facts. Tutankhamun, a minor pharaoh in life, became immortal not because of gold, but because the world needed a story, one where the past could reach out and punish those who dared disturb it. And that's a spell even archaeology can't break. Richard III's spine tells a story, one that Shakespeare never got right. For centuries, the last Plantagenet king was frozen in history as a hunchbacked monster, thanks to the bard's unforgettable line, "Deformed, unfinished, sent before my time into this breathing world, scarce half made up." But when archaeologists unearthed his skeleton beneath a Leicester parking lot in 2012, the bones revealed a startling truth. Richard's so-called deformity wasn't the grotesque hump of legend. It was scoliosis, a curvature of the spine that would have caused one shoulder to sit slightly higher than the other. Forensic analysis showed he could stand straight, ride horses, even wield a sword in battle. The real shock, his condition likely went unnoticed under armor, invisible to most of his subjects. This wasn't just about physical appearance, it was about propaganda. The Tudors, who seized power after Richard's death at Bosworth Field, had every reason to paint him as a villain. Enter Thomas More and later Shakespeare, who turned him into a scheming child killer, immortalized in Richard III as the man who ordered the infamous princes in the Tower murdered. But here's where history gets murky. No concrete evidence links Richard to their disappearance. Some historians argue the boys might have outlived him, while others point to Henry VII, the Tudor king who had equal motive to eliminate rival claimants. Even the timing is suspect. The princes vanished during a period when Richard's hold on the throne was secure, making the act politically unnecessary. The parking lot discovery added fuel to the debate. DNA confirmed the skeleton's identity, but it also revealed injuries consistent with brutal battlefield treatment. His skull showed 8 wounds, including a massive blow to the base likely delivered after death. This wasn't just a king slain in combat, it was a body desecrated by victors eager to erase him. Modern reconstructions of Richard's face, based on his skull, show a man with delicate features and piercing eyes, a far cry from the snarling caricature of stage and page. So why does the myth persist? Because history isn't written by the losers. Richard's rehabilitation isn't about absolving him of all sins. It's about recognizing how easily truth bends to power. The same man accused of tyranny introduced legal reforms protecting the poor from unfair bail, mandated that laws be published in English instead of Latin, and donated generously to churches. None of this fits the monster narrative, yet 5 centuries later, the parking lot became the ultimate irony. A king who fought to control his image in life was finally uncovered, quite literally, beneath the modern world's most mundane space. And in that rediscovery, we're forced to ask, how many other villains of history are just victims of the storytellers who followed them? Queen Victoria's reign wasn't just defined by its length, it was shaped by the bullets that almost ended it. 8 times assassins took aim at the tiny, black-clad monarch, and 8 times she walked away unscathed. The first attempt came in 1840, just 3 years into her rule, when an 18-year-old named Edward Oxford fired 2 shots at her carriage as she rode through London. Both missed. What's chilling isn't just the act itself, it's the sheer randomness of it. Oxford, a bartender with no clear motive, later admitted he'd bought the guns on a whim, practicing in his room until he felt ready. But here's the twist: his pistols misfired due to damp powder, a fluke that saved the Queen. The attacks didn't stop there. In 1842, John Francis tried twice in 2 days, his gun failing to discharge either time. Then came John William Bean, whose pistol was loaded with paper and tobacco, hardly a lethal threat. But the most audacious attempt belonged to Robert Patay, a former army officer who, in 1850, sprinted through a crowd and struck Victoria across the head with a brass-tipped cane. She was left with a bruised face and a fractured sense of security. Yet what's remarkable isn't the violence, it's her reaction. After each attempt, Victoria refused to hide. Instead, she leaned into visibility, riding out the very next day in an open carriage, daring her subjects to see her unshaken. These weren't just brushes with death, they were transformative moments. Before the attacks, Victoria had been a young queen, criticized for her reliance on advisors like Lord Melbourne. But surviving assassination turned her into a symbol of resilience. The public, once skeptical, now rallied around her. Newspapers painted her as the mother of the nation, a monarch who endured dangers alongside her people. Even the mishaps played into her mythos. When teenager William Hamilton's gun misfired in 1849, the Queen quipped, "It's worth being shot at to see how much one is loved." Behind the bravery, though, was a calculated shift in strategy. Victoria's advisors used these incidents to craft a new narrative, a queen who was both vulnerable and indomitable. She began appearing more frequently in public, her image carefully managed to emphasize her ordinariness: a widow, a mother, a woman who shared her people's struggles. By the time her last would-be assassin, 17-year-old Arthur O'Connor, lunged at her with a pistol in 1872, only to be tackled by her own son, the pattern was clear. Every attack had paradoxically strengthened her grip on the throne. The lesson: Victoria understood something few rulers do: survivorship is its own kind of power. Each failed assassination became proof of divine favor, a story she and her supporters wielded masterfully. And in a century of revolutions and upheaval, that story may have been her greatest shield. Because when a queen stares down death and smiles, it's not just courage, it's theater, and no one staged a monarchy quite like Victoria. Caligula's reign was so absurd, even the most outrageous rumors about him strained belief. But the story of his horse Incitatus isn't just a punchline, it's a window into how power corrodes reality. The idea that he appointed his favorite stallion as a consul, complete with a marble stable and ivory trough, sounds like pure fantasy. But dig deeper, and you'll find this wasn't just random madness, it was a calculated humiliation of Rome's elite. By the time Caligula supposedly granted Incitatus senatorial privileges, he'd already spent years systematically dismantling the Senate's dignity. The horse, lavished with jewels and even rumored to have been served dinner invitations, became the ultimate insult, a living symbol of how little the emperor thought of Rome's most powerful men. Was it literal? Probably not. Ancient historians like Suetonius, writing decades later, had every reason to exaggerate Caligula's depravity to justify his assassination. But the myth persists because it captures something true about his reign, a ruler who turned governance into grotesque theater. Consider the context. Caligula inherited an empire bleeding gold, and his early reforms were surprisingly rational. He restored treason trials, rebuilt infrastructure, even recalled political exiles. But after a near-fatal illness, or possibly a mental breakdown, his rule spiraled into sadism and paranoia. He demanded senators race alongside his chariot like slaves, forced them to pledge their wives to him, and allegedly whispered to statues of gods as if they were co-conspirators. Against this backdrop, elevating a horse didn't seem like a leap, it felt inevitable. The deeper tragedy, Incitatus might have been more competent than the senators Caligula despised. The emperor once quipped that his horse only lacked the ability to speak to qualify for office, a jab at the Senate's corruption. Rome's elite were indeed notorious for bribery and infighting, and Caligula's joke exposed their hypocrisy. But satire loses its humor when the joker holds absolute power. By mocking the very institutions that stabilized Rome, he destabilized everything. His antics weren't just cruel, they eroded the empire's foundation. When he was finally stabbed to death in a palace corridor, his last words, "I am still alive," felt like a twisted epilogue to a reign where reality and delusion had blurred beyond recognition. So why does the horse legend endure? Because it's not really about an animal. It's about what happens when authority divorces itself from accountability, when a ruler stops seeing people as citizens and starts treating them as props. Caligula's reign lasted barely 4 years, but his horse outran him in history, galloping straight into infamy as the ultimate shorthand for tyranny's absurdity. And that's the real lesson. Power unchecked by reason doesn't just corrupt. It becomes a spectacle, one where even the spectators aren't safe from the joke. Helena of Aquitaine didn't just accompany her husband on the Second Crusade, she upstaged him in every way imaginable. Picture this, a queen riding into battle not as a demure consort tucked safely in the rear, but at the head of 300 armored knights from her own duchy, her banner flying alongside France's. While King Louis VII fumbled through the campaign with pious indecision, Helena moved with the confidence of a ruler who'd been wielding power since she was 15. Her presence alone was a scandal. Medieval chroniclers gasped at the sight of her ladies dressed as Amazons, their sleeves tied up like warriors, but it was her political maneuvering that truly left Louis in the dust. The crusade was a disaster from the start. Louis, more monk than monarch, hesitated at every turn, alienating allies with his rigid morality. When the army reached Antioch, Helena's uncle ruled the city, and what happened next became legend. She reportedly demanded their marriage be annulled, citing Louis' incompetence, and even hinted at staying behind with her uncle. Some accounts claim she and Louis slept in separate tents from that moment on, their rift as deep as the gulf between their strategies. While Louis insisted on pressing toward Jerusalem against all advice, Helena argued for pragmatism, allying with Antioch to secure the Crusade's flanks. History proved her right. Louis' forces were slaughtered in the mountains while Antioch held firm, but the real bombshell came later. After their humiliating return to France, Helena didn't fade into the background. She leveraged the annulment Louis had feared into freedom, swiftly marrying Henry Plantagenet, who would become England's Henry II. Overnight, her lands, nearly a third of modern France, shifted from French control to English, reshaping European politics for centuries. The Crusade had been the breaking point, but Helena's brilliance was just beginning. Where Louis saw a holy war, she saw chessboard politics, and her next move checkmated an empire. The irony, the same chroniclers who clucked over her unwomanly behavior on Crusade later praised her as the matriarch of the Plantagenet dynasty, mother to kings Richard the Lionheart and John. Helena's Crusade adventure wasn't just a marital spat. It was the moment a queen proved she could outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast any king, and she did it all while wearing armor. Ivan the Terrible's legacy is a blood-stained tapestry of paranoia and violence, but beneath the horror lies a forgotten obsession that could rewrite history. Hidden somewhere under Moscow's Kremlin, if legends hold true, is the Tsar's vanished library, a trove of ancient Greek, Roman, and Byzantine manuscripts so vast, scholars called it the eighth wonder of the world. These weren't just books, they were diplomatic weapons. Ivan's grandmother, Sophia Paleolog, had smuggled them out of Constantinople as the Ottoman Empire crumbled, a dowry of knowledge that included lost works by Aristotle, Virgil, and even early Christian texts purged from the Bible. By the time Ivan inherited them, this collection was priceless, and he guarded it like state secrets. The mystery begins with his sudden death in 1584. No inventory survived, and within decades, whispers spread that the library had been walled up in Kremlin catacombs to protect it from invaders or heretics. Peter the Great reportedly searched for it in vain. Centuries later, Stalin, a man who understood the power of controlling history, secretly funded excavations beneath the Kremlin's foundations. Workers stumbled upon hollow chambers and oak doors sealed with lead, but the project was abruptly abandoned. Some say Stalin feared what they'd find, others claim he simply didn't want to share the glory. Modern technology reignited the hunt. Ground-penetrating radar in 2004 revealed a network of unexplored tunnels beneath the Kremlin's Arsenal Tower, matching 16th-century descriptions of the library's hiding place. But here's the catch: the Russian government has blocked further exploration. Officially, they cite structural risks to the historic site. Skeptics argue the truth is more political. What if the library contains documents challenging Russia's official narrative of its past? Then there's the strangest twist of all. In 1997, a handwritten note surfaced in Estonia, allegedly from Ivan himself, describing a chamber of wisdom hidden behind a coded fresco. The note's authenticity is hotly debated, but if real, it suggests Ivan didn't just hoard knowledge, he weaponized its disappearance, because a lost library is more than a collection of books. It's a ghost, a taunt, a reminder that the past always holds secrets too dangerous to uncover, and for a ruler nicknamed the Terrible, that may have been the point all along. Mary, Queen of Scots, spent 19 years imprisoned by her cousin Elizabeth I, but her mind was never captive. Invisible ink, smuggled notes, and a cipher so complex it defied decoding for 4 centuries. This wasn't just correspondence, it was an espionage masterclass conducted from a prison tower. Then, in 2023, a team of cryptographers finally cracked her code, uncovering 57 secret letters that rewrite our understanding of her final, desperate years. The key to breaking them, a combination of cutting-edge technology and old-fashioned linguistic sleuthing, the same kind Mary herself might have admired. The letters, hidden in plain sight among mundane diplomatic archives, used a sophisticated substitution cipher with symbols replacing letters and null characters sprinkled throughout to throw off eavesdroppers. But Mary's real genius lay in her layers of deception. Some passages were written sideways between lines of innocent text, while others employed homophonic coding, multiple symbols representing the same letter, making frequency analysis nearly impossible. For centuries, historians knew the letters existed but couldn't penetrate their defenses. Then came the breakthrough. Researchers used a customized algorithm to compare the symbols to known samples of Mary's handwriting, cross-referencing her French dialect and grammatical quirks. The result, a backdoor into her clandestine world. The decoded messages reveal a queen as politically shrewd as she was tragically unlucky. In one letter, penned just months before her execution in 1587, she begged her allies to send a cavalry raid to spring her from captivity, a plan that might have worked had Elizabeth's spies not intercepted it. Another exposed her secret negotiations with Spain's Philip II, urging him to invade England on her behalf. But the most heartbreaking passages show her wrestling with betrayal, pouring out grief over abandoned promises from French relatives who'd left her to rot. What makes this discovery explosive isn't just the content, it's the timing. Mary's cipher was far more advanced than anything her jailers could crack during her lifetime, proving she remained a formidable player even in confinement. While Elizabeth's spymaster Francis Walsingham built his reputation on breaking codes, Mary outsmarted him for years. The irony: Walsingham eventually caught her not through cryptanalysis, but by turning her trusted courier into a double agent. Now, with these letters finally readable, we see the full scope of her defiance. Every symbol was an act of rebellion, every null character a middle finger to the regime that locked her away. Mary didn't just write letters, she waged a shadow war with ink and ingenuity, proving that even a captive queen could keep her enemies guessing. And 400 years later, her secrets still have the power to surprise us. Charlemagne, the towering emperor who united much of Europe under his rule, had a secret shame. He couldn't write. For a man who founded palace schools, revived classical learning, and surrounded himself with the greatest scholars of his age, this was more than an irony, it was a personal battle. Historians tell us he kept wax tablets and a stylus beneath his pillow, practicing letters late into the night like a child struggling with homework. Imagine the scene: the most powerful ruler of the early Middle Ages, hunched over in candlelight, scraping clumsy symbols into wax while his empire slept. But here's what makes this story extraordinary. His illiteracy didn't stop him from revolutionizing education. Charlemagne didn't just hire tutors, he turned his court into a beacon of scholarship, importing thinkers like Alcuin of York to design curricula for nobles and commoners alike. He decreed that every monastery and cathedral must have a school, ensuring that future generations wouldn't face the same struggles he did. This wasn't just policy, it was personal redemption. The man who couldn't sign his own name effectively kickstarted Europe's intellectual rebirth after the Dark Ages. The paradox deepens when you examine his methods. Though he never mastered writing, Charlemagne devoured books read aloud to him, from Augustine's theology to Roman histories. His palace at Aachen became a living library, where scribes meticulously copied ancient texts that might otherwise have been lost forever. And those wax tablets, they weren't just props. Letters from his court mention his frustration at forming letters too slowly, revealing a ruler who saw knowledge as power even if it eluded his own grasp. What's often overlooked is how this shaped his rule. Unable to rely on written decrees, Charlemagne became a master of oral tradition, memorizing laws and delivering judgments with theatrical flair. His infamous massacre of Saxons at Verdun, where he ordered the execution of 4,500 prisoners, wasn't recorded in writing until years later. Some scholars argue his reliance on speech over text made him both more persuasive and more ruthless, his words carrying the weight of immediacy that parchment couldn't match. Yet for all his struggles, Charlemagne's legacy is written in the institutions he built. The Carolingian minuscule script developed under his reign became the foundation of modern European handwriting. The schools he funded preserved Greek and Latin texts that would later fuel the Renaissance, and that wax tablet under his pillow, it wasn't just a ruler's insecurity, it was the quiet determination of a man who knew empires aren't built on swords alone, but on the words he fought so hard to understand. Empress Wu Zetian didn't just seize the throne, she rewrote the rules of power with ink. In a world where Confucian tradition declared women unfit to rule, China's only female emperor wielded poetry like a sword, carving her legitimacy into the cultural bedrock of the Tang dynasty. Take her Ode to the Peacock, a seemingly delicate poem that masked a political bombshell. On the surface, it praised the bird's majestic beauty, but every line dripped with subtext. The peacock's golden feathers mirrored her own imperial robes, while its unrivaled elegance subtly challenged the notion that only men could embody divine authority. This wasn't just artistry, it was ideological warfare. Confucian scholars insisted heaven only blessed male rulers, so Wu Zetian hijacked their own symbols. She commissioned poems comparing herself to the phoenix, a mythical bird that symbolized virtuous female power, and flooded the court with verses portraying her reign as a natural extension of cosmic order. Even her choice of the peacock was calculated. Its iridescence echoed Buddhist iconography, tying her rule to spiritual legitimacy at a time when Buddhism was gaining influence. But her most audacious move was reinterpreting the classic of filial piety, a sacred Confucian text. Where it preached female submission, Wu Zetian's scholars produced commentaries highlighting passages about maternal devotion, framing her rule as a form of state motherhood. Her poetry collections were distributed like propaganda pamphlets, performed by court musicians to embed her narrative in the public imagination. The message was clear: if tradition couldn't accommodate her, tradition would be rewritten. The genius of her campaign lay in its duality. To scholars, she spoke the language of classical allusion. To the masses, she became a patron of popular ballads that celebrated her compassion. When drought struck, her poems framed relief efforts as proof of heaven's favor. Never mind that Confucian purists insisted disasters disproved her right to rule. By the time she declared herself emperor in 690, even her enemies struggled to dismiss her as a usurper. She hadn't just climbed the throne, she'd poeticized her way into history, turning verses into vindication. And here's the twist: her strategy outlasted her. Later dynasties tried to erase her legacy, but the peacock refused to fade. Centuries after her death, whispers of her poetry still haunted the halls of power, a reminder that the pen could be mightier than the sword, especially when wielded by a woman who refused to be forgotten. Ferdinand I's throne room might have been draped in Habsburg splendor, but his heart belonged to something far humbler: gourds. Not just any gourds, mind you. We're talking about twisted, bulbous, fantastical specimens that looked like they'd sprung from a painter's dream. By 1562, his obsession had reached such heights that diplomats scrambling for his favor began smuggling rare seeds across borders, turning squash into the most unexpected currency of power. The result, a clause in that year's peace treaty with the Ottoman Empire, explicitly included the gifting of exotic gourd seeds, a detail so bizarre it's hard to believe it wasn't plucked from a satirical play. This wasn't just royal eccentricity, it was Renaissance Europe gone mad for botany. Ferdinand's passion mirrored a larger craze sweeping courts from Vienna to Venice, the green-gold rush of plant collecting. Aristocrats poured fortunes into wonderkammer cabinets filled with seeds from the New World, while scholars penned exhaustive treatises on melons like they were holy texts. The Medici family cultivated citrus groves like jewels, and the Pope's gardeners competed to grow the most grotesquely shaped cucumbers. In this world, Ferdinand's gourds were more than curiosities. They were status symbols, living proof that his empire could tame nature's oddities. But here's where it gets fascinating. The Ottoman seeds weren't just a frivolous demand. They were a covert power play. By accepting Sultan Suleiman's gifts, Ferdinand subtly acknowledged Ottoman horticultural superiority, a safer concession than admitting military weakness. Meanwhile, back in Prague, his gardens became a living atlas of political alliances, each gourd vine a silent testament to treaties and truces. Visitors whispering in shaded arbors wouldn't just admire the fruits, they'd decode the geopolitics tangled in their tendrils. The real twist: Ferdinand's gourds accidentally advanced science. His court botanist Pietro Andrea Mattioli used the imperial collection to pioneer early studies of plant genetics, noting how seeds from Anatolia produced different stripes than those from Hungary. What began as a ruler's whim quietly seeded the roots of modern botany. And that's the delicious irony of gourd diplomacy. It fed both vanity and knowledge, proving that even the strangest obsessions can bear unexpected fruit. Isabella of Castile didn't just lead armies, she scrubbed them into shape. At the height of the Granada campaign in 1482, as dust and blood caked the Spanish forces, she issued a decree so unusual it left even seasoned knights baffled. Every soldier under her command would bathe weekly. In an era when even nobles considered washing a biannual ritual at best, this wasn't just revolutionary, it was borderline heretical. Medieval physicians had long warned that water opened pores to disease, and the church preached filth as piety. But Isabella, with her trademark blend of pragmatism and iron will, saw what others ignored. Grime wasn't just unseemly, it weakened armies. Her logic was brutally modern. Plague had decimated more armies than swords, and she'd watched her father's troops collapse from dysentery during the War of the Castilian Succession. Now, facing the Moors' disciplined forces in Granada's sweltering summers, she refused to let sickness steal her victory. The bathing order came with strict enforcement. Priests turned hygiene inspectors, checking soldiers for cleanliness of person before communion. Barbers, the closest thing to medics in the ranks, were tasked with ensuring communal wash basins boiled between uses, and it worked. While other European armies lost half their men to typhus or the camp fever bred in lice-infested uniforms, Isabella's ranks stayed startlingly intact. This was no isolated quirk. Her hygiene reforms were part of a sweeping overhaul of military discipline unseen since Roman times. She banned gambling in camps to curb brawls, mandated regular pay to prevent looting, and even introduced field hospitals staffed by Jewish and Moorish doctors, a radical move in an age of religious fervor. But the baths were her masterstroke. By the time Granada fell in 1492, foreign observers marveled not just at her tactics but at the eerie health of her troops. The same monarch who'd later fund Columbus's voyage had proven something even more profound. Victory wasn't just about numbers or arms, it was about keeping your soldiers alive long enough to fight. The irony, while Isabella's bathing edict saved thousands, the Inquisition she authorized would soon persecute those very Jewish and Moorish medics who'd helped make her army a model of sanitation. But for one brief campaign, a queen's obsession with soap outshone the darkness of her reign, proving that even the most rigid medieval minds could be washed clean of superstition when survival demanded it. Gustavus Adolphus didn't just charge into battle, he accessorized for it. Picture the Lion of the North, Sweden's warrior king, storming the fields of the 30 Years' War with armor polished to a mirror shine, a feathered hat, and thick black coal rimming his eyes. This wasn't vanity, it was battlefield pragmatism turned into a signature style. The eyeliner, far from a mere fashion statement, served a purpose as sharp as his tactics, reducing glare from the sun, much like modern athletes smearing grease under their eyes. But in an era when Protestant austerity clashed with Catholic opulence, Gustavus's flamboyance sent a deliberate message. While his enemies expected a dour reformer, they got a commander who wielded spectacle as deftly as his cavalry. Behind the theatrics lay one of history's most innovative military minds. Gustavus revolutionized warfare with lighter artillery, mobile infantry squares, and the first standardized uniforms, yet he's overshadowed by his own legend. The same man who introduced the paper cartridge to streamline reloading also insisted his troops maintain crisp, colorful attire even in the mud of battle. His signature look, those smoldering eyes paired with a bright blue sash, wasn't just practical. It made him instantly recognizable to his men amid chaos. When imperial forces faltered under the weight of their own ornate plate armor, Gustavus's streamlined cuirasses and eye-catching banners became symbols of efficiency. The irony, his adversaries mocked him as a peacock king until his tactics obliterated their armies. At Breitenfeld in 1631, his eyeliner-clad gaze surveyed a field where his flexible brigades outmaneuvered the rigid tercios of the Catholic League. The coal might have shielded his eyes from the sun, but it was his brilliance that left Europe squinting at his sudden dominance. Even in death, the contrast stunned. When a cannonball felled him at Lutzen in 1632, his body was found stripped of armor by looters, yet his face still bore the unmistakable marks of a ruler who understood that war isn't just fought with swords but with psychology. Because when a king stares down hell itself with perfectly lined eyes, it's not just a look, it's a dare. Catherine de' Medici didn't just bring Italian art and architecture to France, she smuggled in a dining revolution on the tines of a fork. When the 14-year-old Florentine bride arrived in Paris in 1533, French nobility still ate with their hands, slicing meat with personal knives and wiping grease on their sleeves. The delicate, two-pronged fork she unpacked from her dowry might as well have been alien artifacts. To the French, these tiny utensils weren't just foreign, they were an affront to masculinity. One bishop thundered from the pulpit that forks were the devil's horns, a diabolical plot to corrupt sturdy Frenchmen into effeminate dandies. Even the king's own courtiers whispered that Catherine's refined habits, like using a fork to spear fruit instead of her fingers, were proof of Italian decadence. But Catherine wasn't just indulging a personal quirk. The fork carried a deeper symbolism. It was a weapon in her lifelong campaign to civilize the French court. Back in Florence, forks had been a status symbol since the 11th century, their use spreading from Byzantine nobility to Italian merchant princes. To Catherine, adopting them was about hygiene as much as prestige. At a time when communal dishes swarmed with unwashed hands, the fork offered a tantalizing solution, a way to eat without touching food others had fingered. Yet in France, resistance ran deep. Satirists penned verses mocking fork users as pretentious weaklings, while traditionalists argued that God gave men fingers for a reason. The real turning point came after Catherine became Queen Mother, wielding power through her son's reigns. She staged lavish banquets where forks were placed beside gilded plates, subtly pressuring guests to conform. When her Italian chefs introduced dishes like artichokes and sorbets, foods nearly impossible to eat neatly without utensils, the fork's practicality became undeniable. By the 1580s, even the most stubborn nobles reluctantly admitted that sauce-stained ruffs were less than regal. What began as scandal ended as legacy. The very clergy who'd condemned forks later commissioned silver ones as communion gifts, and by Louis XIV's reign, their use was mandatory at Versailles. Catherine's dining rebellion proved something startling. Sometimes the smallest innovations, those that challenge pride and tradition, reshape culture most profoundly. And in this case, all it took was a tiny piece of metal to turn mealtime into a performance of power. Akbar the Great didn't just build an empire, he built a collision of ideas. Every Thursday night, as the sun dipped below the red sandstone walls of his Fatehpur Sikri palace, the most powerful ruler of the Mughal dynasty did something unthinkable for his era. He handed the floor to his enemies. Hindu pundits, Jesuit priests, Zoroastrian scholars, and Sunni clerics would gather under flickering lanterns, their voices rising in heated debates over divine truth while the emperor listened intently. This wasn't courtly theater. It was intellectual combat, with Akbar as both referee and sponge, absorbing every argument. Imagine the scene: Muslim imams quoting the Quran alongside Jain monks extolling non-violence, while Portuguese missionaries brandished crucifixes across from Sikh gurus. The air must have crackled with tension, yet Akbar insisted on one rule: no bloodshed, only words. At the heart of these debates lay Akbar's restless curiosity. Unlike other rulers who used religion to divide, he saw it as a puzzle to solve. Raised a Sunni Muslim but disillusioned by dogma, he invited critics of Islam to his court, including the fiery Hindu scholar Purushottam and the Jesuit Antonio Monserrate, whose diaries reveal how the emperor grilled him on everything from the Trinity to the Pope's authority. But Akbar wasn't just playing philosopher king, he was engineering a radical social experiment. By forcing clerics of rival faiths to defend their beliefs in public, he exposed the contradictions within all of them. When Orthodox Muslims protested, he doubled down, abolishing the jizya tax on non-Muslims and appointing Hindus to high-ranking posts. The climax of this experiment was Din-i-Ilahi, the divine faith, a religion of Akbar's own making. Blending elements of Islam, Hinduism, Christianity, and even Zoroastrianism, it preached tolerance as the highest virtue. Followers greeted each other with Allahu Akbar, not just praising God but punning on the emperor's name. They abstained from meat, revered the sun, and swore to protect all life. Only a handful ever joined, but Din Allah's real power was symbolic. In a world where rulers demanded conformity, Akbar declared that truth could be plural. The irony, his own son Jahangir would dismantle these reforms, and Din Ilahi faded into obscurity. But those debate nights left an indelible mark. For a few fleeting decades, the Mughal court became the closest thing the pre-modern world had to a secular state, not because it rejected religion, but because it refused to let any one faith monopolize power. And perhaps that's Akbar's greatest legacy, the audacious idea that an emperor's throne could be a front-row seat to the clash of ideas, not just their suppression. Philip II of Spain didn't just rule an empire, he drowned in its paperwork. While other monarchs delegated, this king insisted on approving everything personally, from the wages of shipwrights in Cuba to the thread count of his daughter's embroidery. His court became a labyrinth of red tape, where decisions stalled for months as documents crawled across Europe to his desk in the Escorial. The man who once boasted the sun never set on his domains spent more time squinting at parchment than surveying his territories. And in this obsession lay the slow unraveling of Spain's golden age. Take the infamous case of the Manila galleons. These treasure ships, vital to Spain's economy, often rotted in port while Philip agonized over minor expenses. A single invoice for rope might bounce between 5 councils before reaching him, only to be returned with notes about ink wastage. Meanwhile, Dutch and English privateers, nimble and decentralized, stole entire fleets under the noses of his paralyzed bureaucracy. Even his daughter Isabella's letters weren't spared. When she wrote of knitting a scarf for her father, he replied with a 3-page critique of her yarn choices and instructed her to submit monthly progress reports. This wasn't just control, it was systemic paralysis. Philip's famed consulta system, designed to streamline governance, became its own enemy. Every petition, no matter how trivial, required multiple stamped opinions from overlapping councils. A request to repair a fortress wall in Naples could trigger debates among the Council of War, Council of Italy, and Council of Finance, each scribbling marginalia until urgency faded into oblivion. The irony, while Philip's desk groaned under mountains of paperwork, his empire bled silver to pay an army of clerks who documented its decline in triplicate. The cost was more than inefficiency, it bred a culture of fear. Officials, terrified of royal reprimand, avoided initiative at all costs. When the Invincible Armada sailed against England in 1588, its commanders hesitated at critical moments, waiting for orders that couldn't possibly arrive in time. The result, a fleet outmaneuvered by nimbler rivals whose captains trusted their own judgment. But here's the tragic twist: Philip's mania for detail wasn't incompetence, it was devotion. He truly believed God had entrusted him to oversee every soul and splinter in his realm. Where other kings saw administration, he saw sacrament, each signature a prayer for divine favor. Yet in trying to control everything, he lost grip on the essentials. By his death in 1598, Spain's treasury was hollowed out, its armies overstretched, and its bureaucracy a cautionary tale. The lesson: even the mightiest empire can choke on its own paper trail. Christina of Sweden didn't just reject the crown, she shattered the very mold it was cast from. At age 6, she inherited the throne from her warrior father, Gustavus Adolphus, but by her 20s, she was already flouting every expectation of what a queen should be. While European courts buzzed with gossip about her refusal to marry, Christina's rebellion ran deeper than spinsterhood. She wore men's coats and shoes, cropped her hair short, and reportedly strode through Stockholm's halls with a swagger that left diplomats scandalized. But this wasn't just a phase, it was a full-scale revolt against the narrow confines of her gender. The heart of the scandal lay in her abdication in 1654, a decision that stunned Europe. Citing exhaustion from the burdens of rule, she converted to Catholicism, a faith outlawed in Lutheran Sweden, and fled to Rome, where she turned her court into a salon for philosophers, scientists, and artists. Yet even here she refused to conform. Contemporary accounts describe her holding lively debates in breeches and doublets, hosting gatherings where the era's greatest minds, from Descartes to Bernini, mingled under her patronage. Some whispered she lived openly with female companions in arrangements that blurred the lines of propriety, while others speculated about her close bond with Cardinal Azzolino, a relationship that burned with intellectual passion but reportedly remained celibate. Historians still wrestle with the question, was Christina LGBTQ+, or simply a woman who defied categorization? The evidence is tantalizing but elusive. Her own memoirs dismiss marriage as a form of slavery, and she once quipped that wedlock repelled her as much as death. Yet she also wrote passionately about love between women in classical texts, praising Sappho's poetry with a fervor that suggests more than scholarly admiration. What's undeniable is her lifelong rejection of heterosexual norms, not out of incapacity but conviction. The truth may lie in the cultural chasm between her time and ours. 17th century Europe had no framework for LGBTQ+ identities as we understand them, but it did recognize eccentric women who refused to fit neatly into boxes. Christina weaponized that ambiguity, using it as both shield and sword. By abdicating, she traded political power for something far more radical, the freedom to define herself on her own terms. And in a world that demanded queens be either wives or nuns, her greatest rebellion wasn't her sexuality, it was her insistence that a woman's mind could be her own sovereign territory. Haile Selassie's throne room wasn't guarded by soldiers, it was patrolled by lions. The Ethiopian emperor, a man whose very name meant power of the Trinity, didn't just keep these beasts as exotic pets, he entrusted them with his safety. Trained from cubs to pace the corridors of his Addis Ababa palace, the lions were fed raw meat by Selassie's own hand, their roars serving as living alarm systems against would-be assassins. To visitors, the message was unmistakable. Here was a ruler who commanded even nature's fiercest creatures. Yet beneath the spectacle lay a deeper symbolism, one that would ripple far beyond Ethiopia's borders, straight into the heart of Rastafarian faith. The lions weren't just a display of power, they were a deliberate echo of biblical prophecy. Selassie, born Tafari Makonnen, traced his lineage to King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, a bloodline woven into Ethiopia's national mythology. By surrounding himself with lions, the same animal that adorned Judah's tribal banner, he staked his claim as the Lion of Judah, a title prophesied in Revelation as belonging to the Messiah. When Jamaican Rastafarians, seeking a living embodiment of their liberation theology, looked across the Atlantic, they saw in Selassie not just a king, but a divine figure fulfilling scripture. His lions became sacred extensions of this belief, their very presence proof of his celestial authority, but the reality was more complex than legend. Selassie's relationship with the animals blended reverence and pragmatism. Unlike European royals who kept menageries for amusement, he treated the lions as honored companions, insisting they dine before he did. Some accounts describe him whispering to them in Amharic, their golden eyes locked on his as if sharing secrets. Yet there was always an edge of danger, a reminder that even devotion had limits. When one lion mauled a caretaker, Selassie reportedly ordered its execution without hesitation, demonstrating that loyalty, divine or otherwise, flowed both ways. The irony, Selassie himself seemed ambivalent about the godhood thrust upon him by Rastafarians. Though he never publicly denied it, his private writings reveal a ruler more focused on modernizing Ethiopia than fulfilling millennial expectations. The lions, for all their mystique, were as much diplomatic tools as spiritual symbols, living props in a calculated performance of power. When Haile Selassie addressed the League of Nations in 1936, pleading for help against Mussolini's invasion, Western journalists fixated on his lion tamer persona, reducing his plea to exotic spectacle. Yet the image endured. Long after his death in 1975, the lion's legacy prowled on. Bob Marley's lyrics, Rasta iconography, even the dreadlocks mimicking a lion's mane, all traced back to those regal beasts padding through Selassie's halls. In the end, the emperor understood something timeless. True power isn't just held, it's performed. And what better co-stars than creatures who needed no script to remind the world of a king's unshakable might? Napoleon Bonaparte stormed across Europe with the unstoppable force of a hurricane, toppling empires and rewriting maps with a flick of his sword. Yet this same man, who faced down cannon fire without flinching, reportedly froze in terror at the sight of a house cat. Imagine the scene: the conqueror of Austria, the mastermind of Austerlitz, backing away from a tiny tabby with widened eyes, his voice cracking as he ordered aides to remove that creature at once. This wasn't just a quirk. It was a full-blown phobia, one that historians speculate might have stemmed from a childhood encounter with a feral cat in Corsica. The juxtaposition is almost comical. The man who famously declared impossible is not French, undone by a creature small enough to fit in his hat. But Napoleon's ailurophobia, the clinical term for fear of cats, does something remarkable. It pulls back the gilded curtain on the myth of the invincible general. Here was a leader who micromanaged battlefields down to the placement of individual soldiers, yet couldn't control his own heartbeat when a stray kitten wandered into his quarters. Courtiers noted he'd exit rooms abruptly if a cat appeared, and his valet claimed the emperor once cancelled a strategy meeting because a marmalade Tom had taken up residence under his campaign desk. For a ruler obsessed with projecting unshakable authority, these moments of vulnerability were political liabilities. His enemies, had they known, might have considered recruiting feline saboteurs. The irony runs deeper when you consider Napoleon's other animal interactions. He adored dogs, particularly a pug named Fortuné, who famously bit Josephine on their wedding night. Horses, too, were tools of war he respected, but cats, their unpredictable movements and silent prowling, seemed to trigger something primal in him. Psychologists might diagnose it as a control issue. Napoleon's entire worldview depended on order, precision, and dominance. Cats, with their indifference to human authority, embodied chaos he couldn't command. What makes this phobia historically significant isn't just its strangeness, it's how it clashes with the calculated image Napoleon crafted. The same man who staged coronation paintings to mimic Charlemagne kept this weakness meticulously hidden. No mention appears in his memoirs or letters, suggesting he recognized its power to undermine his myth. Yet today, it's precisely these cracks in the marble facade that make him relatable. We remember Alexander the Great weeping for more worlds to conquer, but Napoleon's feline fear feels touchingly mundane, a reminder that even titans startle at shadows. Perhaps the most poetic twist lies in his exile. On St. Helena, where the once mighty emperor spent his final years, the British governor's children reportedly taunted him by placing cats near his garden. If true, it's a cruel punchline to a colossal life. History's greatest strategist, outmaneuvered in the end by creatures he couldn't bear to face. And in that vulnerability, we glimpse the man behind the legend, not just a conqueror, but a human who, like all of us, carried secret fears into every battle he fought. From lion-guarded emperors to fork-wielding queens, we've peeled back the gilded layers of history to reveal rulers who are far stranger, bolder, and more human than textbooks ever let on. Who could have guessed that Charlemagne, the towering architect of medieval Europe, secretly struggled to write his own name? Or that the fearsome Ivan the Terrible might have hidden a library so revolutionary, even Stalin feared to uncover it? These aren't just quirky footnotes, they're seismic cracks in the marble statues we've built for these figures, proving that behind every crown lay contradictions as dramatic as their reigns. Take Catherine the Great, a visionary leader reduced to a crude punchline by jealous rivals, or Marie Antoinette, whose infamous cake quote became a wildfire of propaganda she never even sparked. Even Napoleon, the man who reshaped continents, met his match in something as small as a house cat. These revelations do more than entertain. They force us to confront how easily history bends to the wills of storytellers, victors, and rumor mills. So what's left lurking in the shadows? If Howard Carter's discovery taught us anything, it's that the past always keeps a few secrets in reserve. Maybe there's a lost diary waiting to rewrite a dynasty, or some long-buried letter poised to shatter another myth. That's the thrill of history. It's never quite finished talking. Now it's your turn. Which of these royal revelations shocked you the most? Or better yet, what's your favorite unsolved mystery of the throne room? Drop it in the comments, because if there's one thing we've learned today, it's that the most fascinating stories aren't always the ones written in ink, but the ones whispered just beneath.